Hi, strangers. A quick warning. Today's episode involves violence against children. Listener discretion, as always, is advised. It's the early morning hours of June 10th, 1912, in Villisca, Iowa. On East 2nd Street, an elderly woman named Mary Peckham leaves her home to begin her morning chores around her property. As the warm summer sun gets brighter, Mary notices how quiet her morning has been. Too quiet. It's almost 7 and her neighbors, the Moores, have not come out to feed their chickens or any animals in their barn, which is strange. But even stranger, the Moore house is dead silent. 39-year-old Sarah Moore and her husband, 43-year-old Josiah, had 4 young children, all under the age of 12, and their 10-year-old daughter Mary Catherine had a sleepover with 2 local girls the night before as well. So Mary Peckham was unsettled by the fact that despite it being filled with 6 rambunctious children, not a sound could be heard from the house next door. Mary made her way up the 3 wooden stairs that led to the Moores' covered front porch. She approached the solid wood front door and knocked. But no one answered. Not a single noise was heard from inside the house. Mary knew the Moores well, so she tried the front door, thinking she could let herself in, but it was locked. Again, this was strange. No one locked their doors in Villisca. There was no reason to. It was a safe community where everyone knew everyone else. Mary didn't know where the Moores were, but she knew work needed to be done on their small plot of land. She let the Moores' chickens out of their coop and went home to call Josiah's brother, Ross. Mary told Ross about the quiet house, the locked door, and the lack of morning chores, which led Ross to come over right away. Like Mary, Ross knocked on the door, but there was no response. He shouted out for his brother, but again, nothing. Nothing. Ross pulled out his copy of his brother's key and unlocked the door, while Mary waited anxiously on the front porch. Ross walked into the parlor room, and just as he stepped onto the wide, wooden planks of the floor, he knew something was off. All signs would suggest his brother's family was home. Their coats and shoes were all where they should be, but the house was silent. Cloth covered all the windows, preventing any sunlight into the house. And even stranger, every glass or reflective surface in the house was also covered with cloth. All the mirrors, all the glass bottles, everything was covered. In the dark, Ross made his way into the sewing room, which was also used as the guest bedroom. He slowly opened the door and was presented with a horrendous sight. 2 little girls lay on the bed, motionless. One was lying vertically as if still sleeping. The other was lying across the bed, horizontally. They both had a cloth covering their faces, but massive amounts of blood had seeped through that fabric, and it was obvious that they were dead. Ross ran out of the house and told Mary to call the local peace officer, Henry Horton. When Officer Horton arrived, he entered the Moore house expecting a horrific sight. The 2 bodies that Ross had found in the guest room were local girls who little Mary Catherine Moore had invited for a sleepover. 8-year-old Ina Stillinger and her 12-year-old sister, Lena Stillinger. In the room with the Stillinger girls was a bloody axe leaning against a wall. Officer Horton made his way up the narrow wooden staircase leading to the other 2 bedrooms. In the first, he found the 4 Moore children: Herman Montgomery, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur Boyd, 7, and Paul Vernon, 5. All were dead in their beds, cloth covering their bloody faces. In the second bedroom, the parents, Sarah and Josiah, were also in their bed. Their blanket pulled all the way up, covering their faces. When Horton pulled the blanket down to reveal the dead couple, he was faced with a bloody mess. Both Sarah and Josiah's heads had been beaten into a bloody pulp and no longer resembled anything human. As Officer Horton looked around the blood-stained house, he had no way of knowing he was about to investigate a murder that would haunt the American Midwest forever. This is the story of the Villisca Axe murders. Hi, strangers. This is your host, Alexa Morrissey, and if you listened to last week's episode, you know it took place in Iowa, which is known as one of the safest states in America. And yet, that case got me thinking about another crime that occurred there, one of the most terrifying true crime cases in American history. It's a story that has baffled the public for over 100 years, and now it's time to revisit it. So lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Villisca is a small southwestern town in Montgomery County, Iowa. It was founded by a man named D.N. Smith in 1872. According to VilliscaHistory.org, the founder named the town Villisca because he said it meant pretty place or pleasant view in the language of the area's original inhabitants, the Sac and Fox Nation. But according to the Des Moines Registrar, the founder misinterpreted the Sac and Fox word Villisca, which actually meant evil spirit or evil place. In 1912, the town had about 2,500 people and was about 50 miles from a rail line that connected Vermont, northeast all the way through Chicago to the Midwest. According to the United States Census Bureau, the city only has a total area of 1.90 square miles, or 4.92 kilometers. Despite its size, by the turn of the century, it became a hub for developing businesses, perhaps due to its proximity to the railway. At the time, more than 24 passengers and freight trains stopped in the area daily. It became a magnet for businessmen who were looking to capitalize on the area's growth. And one of those eager businessmen was Josiah Moore. Josiah was born on December 29, 1868, in Hanover, Illinois, but his family moved to Villisca shortly after his birth. Josiah was one of 8 siblings. In his 20s, Josiah worked at a hardware and agricultural supply store owned by a man named Frank Jones. In the late 1800s, when Josiah had saved enough money to start his own business, he opened up a shop directly across the street from Frank Jones. Josiah became the owner and operator of the Moore Implement Company, a John Deere company franchise. With the business thriving, Josiah became one of Villisca's more prominent businessmen. On December 6, 1899, Josiah married a local woman named Sarah Montgomery. 3 years later, they purchased a house at 508 East 2nd Street. The home was similar to most others in the area. It was a timber house, about 600 square feet, with 2 bedrooms, a parlor, a sewing room, a kitchen, and an outhouse. There was also a barn that had been built by its previous owner. By 1912, the Moores had 4 children: Herman, who was 11, Mary Catherine, who was 10, Arthur, who was 7, and Paul, who was 5. According to multiple sources, the Moore family was well-liked and highly respected in Villisca. They were active members of the First Presbyterian Church, and on June 9th, the family attended a special evening children's program, which Sarah Moore had actually coordinated. 10-year-old Mary Catherine was a part of that evening's program, along with her 2 friends, Ina and Lena Stillinger. After the program was over, Ina and Lena went back to the Moore house, as it was only a 5-minute walk from the church. The Stillinger sisters were from another wealthy local family that lived on a large farm 7 miles from town. At around 6 p.m., Josiah called the Stillinger family home to ask if the girls could stay over because Mary Catherine and the sisters wanted to have a sleepover. The sisters were given permission to stay over, and at around 10 p.m., everyone started getting ready for bed. The Stillinger sisters slept in the downstairs sewing room on a twin bed the Moores had added for guests. Mary Catherine went upstairs with her brothers in the bedroom next to her parents. Now, because of the extensive research into this case over the years, we have a decent idea of what happened next. The exact time frame for the murders could not be determined, but a local doctor said the attack happened sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning. So, sometime after midnight, someone, or multiple someones, entered the Moore home through an unlocked door. Not locking your door was common at this point in the community. The intruder grabbed an oil lamp from a nearby table and rigged it to burn low, only supplying just enough light for one person to see a little in front of them. He then grabbed an axe that belonged to Josiah, most likely the one he kept in the coal shed. The intruder ignored the sleeping Stillinger girls on the first floor and made his way up the wooden stairs to the second, where the Moore family slept. He entered the main bedroom where Josiah and Sarah were peacefully sleeping, put the lamp down on the floor, and raised the axe above his head. He brought the axe down on Josiah first. The Moore patriarch was struck over 30 times with the blade of the axe, more than any of the other victims. The ceiling had a gouge mark from when the murderer lifted the axe above his head to murder Josiah. Josiah was so badly cut up by the axe that one of his eyes came out of its socket. The axe murderer then moved on to Sarah. Some sources say that Sarah was struck with the blade of the axe like Josiah. Others say she was bludgeoned with the blunt end. Either way, the two adults were so badly attacked that neither had a face to recognize the next day. The killer then made his way to the Moore children's room. Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul were each bludgeoned in the head like their parents. The killer had used the blunt end of the axe for them. There were no signs that any children woke up during the attacks. After killing the children, the murderer then went back into the parents' room and continued to bludgeon Sarah and Josiah. We know this because blood from Josiah had run across his pillow and filled one of Sarah's shoes, which she had left under the bed. The shoe tipped over on its side with dried blood on its sole. Apparently, the killer had tipped the shoe over after it had filled with blood. Doctors also later observed that some axe blows to Sarah's face were clean with no blood in them, suggesting they were made after her blood had stopped circulating. Once he was satisfied with his violence against the parents, the killer made his way back downstairs and killed the two Stillinger sisters. Investigators believed that all of the victims, except for 12-year-old Lena Stillinger, had been asleep when they were murdered. They determined this because Lena was the only one with an obvious defensive wound. She had a large cut across her arm, as if she raised it up to shield herself. There are some sources, however, that say this was actually just a blood stain and not a cut, so whether she was awake is up for debate. She was also found lying across the bed rather than in a normal sleeping position like the other victims. Lena's nightgown was pushed up to her waist and her naked lower half was exposed. It is believed that the killer intentionally posed Lena in this sexually explicit way. The killer then walked around the home, ritualistically covering all the mirrors and reflective surfaces. He then covered the victims' faces with pieces of cloth or some kind of clothing. He closed all the window blinds, and on the two windows without them, he draped pieces of clothing. At some point during all this, he took several pounds of raw bacon out of the icebox, wrapped it in a towel and placed it in the sewing room with the axe and the two Stillinger girls. Next to the bacon wrapped in the towel, he left a keychain that didn't belong to any of the Moores. And let's just pause to talk about the bacon wrapped in the towel. There have been a lot of theories online about what this was about. One of the most prevalent theories is that the bacon was rolled up and made to form a sort of artificial vagina for the killer to masturbate with. There is nothing in any reputable source material that I read to suggest this, but because the bacon was found near the sexually posed Lena, I perhaps understand how this theory came about. A pail of bloody water was found in the home, suggesting the killer washed his hands. The killer then made himself a plate of beans and bread before he left, which he ate in the Moore's kitchen. Around 5 a.m., the killer left the house, taking one of the house keys so he could lock the door behind him. The victims were found a few hours later by Josiah's brother Ross after their neighbor raised the alarm. Now, Ross called Villisca's peace officer, Hank Horton, to the house right after he discovered the bodies. But this is 1912. And if you know anything about early crime scene protocol, you know there was barely any. Horton did not secure the scene. And by not securing the scene, I mean he basically let the whole town run amok in the house. Upwards of 100 people walked through that house that day, completely contaminating the scene. Horton even let some townspeople handle the murder weapon. That's right, people were picking up the bloody axe while the bodies still lay in the beds. There are even some reports that say people took fragments of Josiah's skull as a souvenir. This was a time before DNA, but that doesn't make any of this less disrespectful to the victims. The county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, arrived at the scene of the crime at approximately 9 that morning, and he was appalled by the way the home was being treated. He was the one to urge Horton to call in the National Guard to secure it, as the National Guard's armory was actually located in Villisca. Later in the evening of June 10th, the 8 bodies were finally examined by Dr. S.S. Williams. According to the doctor, the murders happened at some point between midnight and 5 the morning of June 10th. Each of the victims had been struck with the axe 20 to 30 times, with Josiah getting the most strikes. This suggested to investigators that perhaps Josiah was the killer's real target. Despite 12-year-old Lena being found with her nightgown pulled up and her lower half exposed, there were no signs of sexual assault on any of the victims. According to investigators, blood splatters in the house suggested the killer was left-handed, as he favored that side when he swung the axe. Despite many rumors, both at the time of the murders and online today, there was no evidence at the scene that the killer hid in the house, waiting until everyone was asleep before he struck. No footprints, no cigar or cigarette butts, and no tobacco juice were found in any hidden places. So, to recap, we have 8 victims, no witnesses, a killer with a several-hour head start, and a completely contaminated crime scene. It was no surprise that local police had very few leads in the early days of the investigation. The first thought was that the killer was a transient, just passing through town. Remember, everyone knew everyone else in Villisca. It was hard for them to imagine one of their own doing such a heinous thing. And this was a railroad town. Many travelers came through this area. One of those travelers was a minister named Reverend George Kelly. The Reverend had arrived in town the day before the murders to attend the children's program that Sarah Moore directed and the girls were a part of. The whole Moore family and the Stellinger girls were present at this church program. The Reverend was seen at the church and then left Villisca on a train around 5 in the morning the bodies were discovered. According to some passengers on that train, the Reverend allegedly spoke about the murders several hours before the bodies were discovered by police, and the news spread throughout the town. Even more suspicious, Reverend George Kelly returned to Villisca 2 weeks after the murders and inserted himself into the investigation. Now, the news of him talking about the murders on the train had not gotten back to the Villisca police yet, so they didn't know to be on the lookout for him. On his return trip, the Reverend was able to convince local police that he was an out-of-town detective and got a full tour of the crime scene from investigators. And in the weeks following the murders, the Reverend wrote many letters to the police, investigators, and family of the victims. A private investigator actually wrote back to Reverend Kelly, asking for details about the murders, and he apparently replied with great detail, claiming to have witnessed the killings. This Reverend seems like a rock-solid suspect, right? Well, Reverend Kelly's past suggested he wasn't the most reliable source. Reverend Kelly suffered from mental illness most of his life. He allegedly had a severe mental breakdown in his teenage years and was described by most as a peculiar man. His mental illness made authorities question whether or not he was imagining his involvement in the murders. And let's not forget, there is no physical evidence tying the Reverend to the crime scene, and the information he had about the crimes could have come from his in-depth tour of the house when he pretended to be the detective. 2 years after the murders, in 1914, the Reverend was arrested for sending obscene material through the mail. He was harassing women who had applied to a posting he put out about a secretary position at his office. The Reverend was admitted to St. Elizabeth's Mental Hospital after his arrest, and investigators in Villisca decided it was time to question him about the murders again while he was in custody. After hours of intense questioning, Reverend George Kelly did confess to killing the 8 victims on that summer night in 1912. He signed a statement saying, "I killed the children upstairs first, and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to my mind, and I picked up the axe, went into the house and killed them." Unfortunately, Reverend Kelly immediately recanted his statement after the interrogation, suggesting the confession may have been coerced. In 1917, a grand jury assembled to hear evidence linking the Reverend to the murders. There were a couple of issues with this, though. 1, there was no physical evidence linking the Reverend to the crime. 2, while the Reverend was left-handed, just like the crime scene suggested the killer was, he was also 5'2". If you remember, there were dents in the ceiling from the killer swinging the axe upward. At his height, the Reverend would not be able to hit the ceiling with the axe. 3, one of the most incriminating things the Reverend did was allegedly tell people on the train about the murders before the story had reached the public. Well, the passengers who came forward with this information later changed their story and said they might not have correctly remembered the time he told them about the murders. Because of all this, the first grand jury to hear the Reverend's case was hung and refused to indict him. The second jury did the same and let him go. While the Reverend ended up being a dead end for investigators, there was another suspect they were looking into. I want you to think back to the beginning of the episode when I told you a little bit about Josiah Moore's history. If you recall, Josiah spent many years working at a hardware and supply store owned by a man named Frank Jones. When Josiah left Jones's store, he opened up his John Deere franchise directly across the street from his old boss. Josiah did this to taunt Jones, because at the time of his departure, Josiah and Jones's relationship had grown contentious. Josiah had always been Frank Jones's star salesman. He worked tirelessly for the man for 7 years, but Jones refused to increase his pay or give him better hours. According to the Smithsonian Magazine, Jones made Josiah work from 7 in the morning to 11 at night, 6 days a week. Eventually, Josiah had enough of the mistreatment and left to start his own business, taking a valuable John Deere account with him. According to the residents of Villisca, by 1912, Jones and Josiah Moore's hatred toward each other became so intense that they began to cross the street to avoid each other, making a show of their mutual disdain. Just like the Reverend, however, there was nothing solid to tie Frank Jones to the crime scene. As you can probably guess, the Villisca axe murders remain unsolved to this day, partially due to how poorly preserved the crime scene was at the beginning of the investigation. Over the years, many potential suspects have been brought up, but none can ever be solidly tied to the crime scene. There is a very good chance Frank Jones or Reverend Kelly could have been the actual killer. But as I said, there was never any physical evidence. There is one more suspect I want to tell you about. Well, more of a phantom than a suspect, really. In 1912, Villisca was not the only Midwest town near a rail line to have a vicious axe murder occur. In fact, in 1911 and 1912, there was a bizarre chain of axe murders following the major railways through the Midwest, suggesting that a transient serial killer was at large. And that is what we will discuss next week on a new episode of Stranger in the House. Until then, stay safe, strangers, and thanks for listening. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources will be linked in the show notes.